All right, good evening. We are going to go ahead and call this work session to order. Go ahead with roll call, Al.
Been a while. Benson.
Here.
Brunig.
Here.
Johnson.
Present.
Mybom.
Present.
Minor.
Here.
Villanueva.
Here.
Mayor Mosier.
Here.
City Manager Leon.
Here.
City Attorney Denherter.
Here.
All right, before we move on to our agenda for the evening, is there anybody from the public that would like to address the commission on something not on the work session agenda? Seeing nobody, all right, we are going to talk all things cannabis. And I don't know, City Manager Leon or Ross, who wants to start and get us going?
Sure. Honorable Mayor Mosier, members of the commission, in your packet you have three things which Ross is going to walk you through. We also have our cannabis consultant who is on the go-to with us if you have questions for Bill, or Bill, if you'd like to interject as Ross is presenting. Basically, this evening, we'd like to go through the ordinance in what we believe is a pretty solid draft for you to take a look at. We have changed some things, and we did not change some things, and we have some reasons for that, so Ross will be discussing that. Then we'd like you to take a look at the resolution for the rate structure, and that is in draft form. You won't be acting on that this evening. You'll see that probably at our next City Commission meeting. So we'd like you to talk out that rate structure and let us know, are we on the right path? Is it too high? Is it too low? What you'd like to see changed. And then we're going to talk a little bit about our personnel policy handbook and the direction we're headed there. We don't expect you to craft any of the language tonight, but just to let us know, are we being too conservative? Are we being too liberal? We have some discussion to be had about volunteers, in that we have a full volunteer fire department, and we think we have a solution there, but we want to run that past you as well. So Ross is going to lead the discussion and probably ask you some pointed questions to make sure we can move forward, but we think we can get all this done in an hour.
Thank you, City Manager. Commissioners, I'm going to give a quick summary of the ordinance rather than take us through every section like we did last time, and then I will point out the sections that we focused our attention since our last meeting. So essentially in the ordinance, we are creating a licensure structure for medical cannabis dispensaries. Under the statutory scheme, there are a number of different types of medical cannabis establishments. This is only licensure for the dispensary portion of it. So there's no licensure available for growing operations or processing facilities, at least at this time. It is unlawful in the city of Yankton to operate a dispensary without a license. The process requires submitting an application to the city that contains certain information, such as a site plan and location information and information about the owners and potentially the employees or operators if they are known at the time the application is submitted. There will be an application fee that is established by resolution of this commission once the ordinance is passed. Once that fee has been submitted with the application, the city will go through its process to review the application and confirm that it meets the criteria within the ordinance. And then if it is determined that all criteria are met, the city manager or the city manager's designee will approve that application and a provisional license will be granted. If a license is not granted, there is an appeal process by which the denied application can be submitted to this board for commission approval. Once the license has been issued, it is provisional in nature, which means it gets submitted to the state, and the state will determine whether a registration will follow. The state ultimately decides if there's a limited number of licensees that may operate in Yankton. The state will decide who gets those. Under the framework we have now, we are starting with 2 medical cannabis dispensaries. That does not apply to the recreational side of things. That will be handled through a separate ordinance later, depending upon what the Supreme Court does with the current challenge to the recreational marijuana amendment. If the state fails to issue a registration to an applicant who receives a city license, the city license will automatically terminate. If the state issues a license and the state issues a registration, there are limited time frames in which the facility must be completed. So nobody has to incur build-out expenses until you've been approved by both the city and the state, but you are on the clock to get it completed at that point. Once the state has issued its registration, then an annual license fee established by resolution of this commission will also be payable, and that will be payable on an annual basis. There are rules of operation. The rules of operation require that dispensary operates only between the hours of 9 a.m. and 9 p.m. One of the things that was discussed in the last work session was potentially setting those hours of operation by resolution of the commission, so this board could adjust on the fly. Staff in our committee kind of agonized over that particular issue because that allows a change to happen at one commission meeting with very little opportunity for public input, and that can have rippling effects for the business owners who are trying to staff their operations and understand who's working when and things of that nature. And we thought that we can easily change it as a board through the ordinance modification process, requiring just an additional meeting and publication of that change. So it just draws the process out a little bit, but it's not terribly hard to adjust the hours if we feel that that's necessary. So that was the one piece of feedback where, after a lot of discussion, we opted to stick with a time frame. But what we did do, we felt it made sense to open that time frame up and allow the business owners to set their own hours within the marketplace, 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. They don't have to be open all of that time, and they can set staffing accordingly. But for reasons that made sense for law enforcement, 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. seemed to fit based on manpower and having those operations closed down at night in time for the bar crowd to begin doing what they do after dark. So there is a criminal penalty for operating without a license. If an operator sells cannabis products to someone under the age of 21, the license is automatically suspended, and in order to reinstate the license, there's a substantial reinstatement fee, $10,000 after the first offense, $15,000 after the second offense, and if there's a third or subsequent offense, there's no opportunity to reinstate the license. One of the things that was changed following the last work session was adding in the statutory definition of medical cannabis establishment to clarify that we are only licensing the medical cannabis dispensaries. Specifically, we made reference to that phrase, medical cannabis establishment, in one of the ordinances that had been drafted, but we did not include the statutory definition. So that was designed to clarify. Other changes that were made in the dispensary requirements section under 13-140, we tidied those up, made them a little more grammatically sound. And the section that wasn't ready yet when we had our last work session, in particular relates to the facility standards. We spent some time with our group focusing on what do we require to make it easier for us to help those facilities if there was a break-in, for instance, and to minimize the possibility that there would be a break-in, and to minimize the loss if there were a break-in. So that's largely what these changes relate to, but I'm going to summarize these for the group real quick. First thing that we're requiring is a breezeway entryway. So there is a separation. When you walk in the front door, you will have an area where you have to present your driver's license. You'll have to present your medical marijuana card that is issued by the state. And then once your identity is verified, you can be buzzed into the sales floor. Then when you are done purchasing your products, there is a separate exit so you will not cross paths with people who are walking in. The facility must have locked display cases that are only accessible to staff during business hours. You can think of a setup that's perhaps more like a jewelry store in that way. The facility must have a locked vault or drug enforcement agency storage cage in which all cannabis products, and undeposited funds will be stored outside of business hours. So at night, just like a jewelry store, everything gets locked up and put away. The facility must conform to all prevailing building, plumbing, electrical, mechanical, and fire codes that are adopted by the city. All entrances and exits and parking areas and sidewalks adjacent to the facility must be lighted at all times after dark. So it's easier for law enforcement to drive by and keep an eye on things. We are requiring that each facility maintain high-definition cameras of sufficient quantity and quality to be mounted in a manner to fully capture the facial features of all people entering the facility at each point of entry or exit, and to capture the facial features and actions of all the people in all locations inside the facility, excepting only the restrooms. And the camera system shall require secure storage of no less than 30 days of footage. That will make it much easier for law enforcement to assist if something bad should happen. The facility must also then have a functional commercial alarm system triggered by the press of a button, by the breaking of glass, and by the forcing open of a locked door. So we think that is the list of needs in order to help them if they are the subject of a burglary or some other adverse law enforcement event. I've already mentioned the change we made for the hours of operation. I am curious if that's acceptable to this group. We didn't want to presume that just because we discussed it and it made sense to us, that was in fact the will of this group. So feel free to let us know your thoughts. If you want me to cover anything in more detail, we certainly can. And I'm also interested in the fees, the structure that we set for those. So go ahead and commence discussion.
Ross, I want to back up to 13-145. So the rules, I love all the security measures put in place, because obviously I would imagine a lot of these rules are what the owner of the establishment would want anyway. Is this pretty typical for a business like this, and even consulting with Mr. Effington or anything like that? Is that pretty typical rules? We're not outside the box on anything, are we?
So I'll let Mr. Efting give you his impression. We had an opportunity to speak with operators of these facilities, and we asked the question, if you were going to mandate things that made sense for proper security and safety, the stuff that was learned by trial and error out in Colorado, what would you want to see? And that's where a lot of these things came from. But as to what is typical, I'd leave that up to Mr. Efting to weigh in on.
Thanks, Ross. It's very typical, and a lot of the dispensaries have 40 to 50 cameras inside. They do that for their safety. They do it to keep an eye on their employees, and just overall good business practices that I think their business really pushed. After the first couple of years in Colorado, we did have a lot of break-ins, and we did have some problems with security. And over the last 10 years, most of the dispensaries that I'm aware of have adopted these type of security measures.
And that's a closed circuit system?
I believe so, yes.
None of them are linked to PD directly?
No.
Okay.
I have a question about the breezeway that's put. I guess perspective-wise, so we're not Sacramento, California, we're Yankton, South Dakota. I don't envision there being long lines at any given point in time for this, but I understand the usefulness of having the breezeway. However, there's, half a dozen downtown buildings where I can envision a dispensary like this setting up shop. But as I'm reading this breezeway, so you enter from in the front door, and then it's like, now you're in the breezeway, and that's where you get ID'd. And then there's an entrance then into the area where you can follow through on your transaction. Then there has to be a separate exit out of this transactional area that would preclude you from going back out the front door.
Correct.
Okay,
Yeah.
so that, I guess I would guess I would just reintroduce maybe some perspective here. I think if we're going to just have, a handful of like these downtown buildings in mind, that might be a limitation that would immediately exclude some potential good locations for a dispensary like this. Might be a little bit overly cautious. Again, I understand the importance of folks coming in and right away not seeing product. And there's some definite usefulness for people when they first walk in, get ID'd, and then you get rung in. But I guess if in that same entryway they can't just come back in or get buzzed back in, and given all these cameras, that we can't still make this work for a lot of the potential locations that I see dispensaries potentially looking at in Yankton, South Dakota.
So maybe instead of breezeway, could we also say it could be a waiting room area? So you could have seating in there. So you go up to a window or something, your identity is verified, then you would get buzzed back into the sale room.
I don't see why not.
Maybe we can play with,
Work for medical, because you're not going to have folks waiting in line. But if you do go to recreational, and the state of South Dakota does, you will have people standing in line. And one of the things about getting a medical license in Colorado, what we saw was it's the gateway to getting the recreational license, because that's where the money is.
Bill, do you have a thought on, instead of a breezeway, you really have kind of a waiting area? Simply because you're retrofitting an old building that otherwise is perfect, but there's only, one entrance into that facility. I think that's what Tony's point was. Do you have a thought on that? Bill?
I don't know if he has a thought, Ross. My thought would be that we call it reception area or like vestibule or something like that, as opposed to, waiting implies that a medical facility, I think. Well, I don't know. I think it should be more of a generic term.
Yeah, I think that there were two things that you get from using a breezeway. One, an opportunity to very clearly make sure you know who's going in.
I'm having a hard time hearing anybody.
Can you hear me now, Bill? Might be having some technical problems.
I'm going to turn my mic off and turn it back.
Ross,
Yeah.
in addition, was there a reason, other than the fact that a breezeway would have been a smaller area, is there a reason why they wanted a separate exit? I
think the notion was if someone was going to do something illegal by giving marijuana purchased inside to somebody who shouldn't have it, That was going to have to take place outside the dispensary. It wouldn't be something that happens on the grounds. So they can control the flow, the people that are coming in, get their stuff, and then they're out of there. And what they do from there is their criminal behavior if they're going to break some rules. There's no opportunity for that to occur on site.
So in this case, would it be useful for us just to, I guess, put ourselves in the position of a potential incoming business to give them that option? Because the onus would be on them, right?
Right.
They have to be in control of the substances that they are dispensing. So if they feel or can present as part of their application a scenario where inside of their breezeway, they believe they can adequately control the flow, okay. But otherwise, if they also have the means and they want to create a building that goes above and beyond or takes advantage of the option of a separate exit, great. I don't know if it just, I'm just not sold on the fact that it makes sense for us to require that at the outset.
How do the rest of you guys feel?
So are we worried that, I'm sorry, I'm a little confused. Often I'm confused. So the concern is that we won't have two entrance exits in downtown buildings? Is that the problem? Don't we have to have two entrances and exits for fire?
We could send them back into the alley in some cases.
Could we solve this, Ross, by putting a clause in the ordinance that said, design criteria may be altered in a historically significant or retrofitted pre-existing structure as subject to approval by community development and
That's what I was going to say.
the
Would there
Yankton
be,
Police Department. I mean, I'm just thinking we have a lot of, we have a historic district in our downtown, which is an eligible location, and maybe there's just instead of trying to design through the language, if someone brings a proposal that we feel confident with.
And quite frankly, this commission doesn't have to accept all of these changes in here. I mean, it might make sense to just strike the thing that says you have to leave through a separate exit, because you can have a secure entrance or a waiting area. You just have to go back out through that on the way out. And the primary purpose is to very clearly get the idea of all those coming in, and you'll have that. Just by going through the separate exit, you can prevent that opportunity for the buddies who are waiting in the entryway to get a handful of dope from the guy who had the card on the way out. They could do that in the street anyway, though, I guess, so.
Yeah, I guess, I felt like in our group, Commander Brandt was pretty confident about having the two entrance and exits, the entrance and the exit, but it's the
It's
commission's
up to the
purview.
commission, right?
Who is this?
Commander Brandt.
Yep.
And I don't know, Chief, do you have an opinion on?
he's making his way. Bill, can you hear us?
I don't think he can. Maybe I'll text him and ask if he can log in and log back out.
Okay.
How about now? There we go. Madam Mayor, members of the commission, one of the things that Commander Brandt was looking at is just exactly what Ross was talking about, but some of those historic buildings, they're going to pass the marijuana one way or the other, and if we know who's coming in, we know who does the passing anyway. So I don't see that as being as critical an issue, particularly in the downtown area. But I think the other things you described are probably fairly important. The fact that they have to be identified coming in, I think, is the most important piece of this whole thing. And that's my opinion.
So to that point, then I think the easiest change that I think gets us to the idea you were talking about, Commissioner Maibaum, is just striking that sentence that requires one-directional exits. We're just required some sort of entry breezeway or waiting space or.
One other concern that I would have had, if you have those downtown areas where they have to go out the back, And that actually makes them walk all the way around the block, and they can become victims as they come out and have to move around the building. So I think that can become a hazard for them, the person that's actually getting medical marijuana as well. So those are just trade-offs that you look at.
You guys like that change? Okay, I'll go ahead and make that.
Ross, procedurally, are we okay since we haven't had our first reading?
Yep, so we'll just, when you guys do your first reading tonight, it'll be subject to that specific change. So when we get to our second reading, that won't really be a change because you will have approved it in that condition.
And Mr. Efting's logging out and logging back in, so we'll see if he can hear us when he gets back logged in.
All right. Any other commission thoughts just on the ordinance itself? Otherwise, in essence of time, I want to make sure with 3 items to go through tonight that maybe we move to the resolution. Ross, you want to go through that on the fees?
Sure, you bet.
Mr. Efting, are you back with us? Can you hear us?
Yes, I am.
Okay, perfect. We're just moving on now.
My camera off. There we go.
Okay, we're just moving now to our resolution regarding rates.
Sounds good.
Okay, so if the commission is in favor of this resolution, it will be adopted based on my communication with Colleen Bailey, it's scheduled to be on the agenda for the last meeting in June. It's 24th, I think that is.
No, we'll put we put the ordinance and this resolution on the 14th.
Okay.
If the commission's ready.
Yeah.
If the commission isn't ready, then we would schedule it
Fair.
accordingly.
Just timing wise, it has to come last. That's the only key. So the commission must have a first and second approval of the ordinance, then we can take up the resolution. But the resolution just completes the provision under section 13-142 and 143. The initial application fee, we are proposing to be $1,500. That would be a non-refundable fee. And that would offset the city's costs to evaluate the plans and do the background checks of the business owners and proposed employees. If the city issues a license and the state registers that entity, then the annual license fee would be due, and that would be $3,000 a year. That would also then, of course, cover the costs of the city to supplement its background checks each time an employee is added to the staff of any licensed facility. So the employees will have their background checks completed as they're hired, as opposed to at a given point once a year, which prevents the opportunity for layoffs just in time to be relicensed and then rehiring people that would otherwise not fit. So it's the same thing we do with taxi cab licensing. As drivers are added to the companies, those drivers submit supplemental applications, and the city will then do a background check. So it would work similar to that process. Do those fees seem okay to this group?
In the fees, Ross, that you talked about for a violation, those aren't in this resolution, so those would be set through the ordinance and would have to go through 2 readings should we decide those fees.
Correct.
This is just for the application fees.
Yes.
Great, I just wanted to clarify.
Is this in the realm of what most application fees cost?
Bill, would you like to weigh in on that?
Yeah, it's right in the middle, and it's not high by any stature, but it's also a high enough fee where if you're going to apply, you need to take it very seriously, because the medical marijuana business is a very expensive business to be in. And I think it will help the application process to look at people that are really serious about getting in the business.
And this is the fee, the $1,500 fee up front to the city is the one that then we would review pass it on to the state. There's no guarantee that the state is going to approve.
Correct.
Okay, got it.
In fact, I'm anticipating we're going to get a pretty good handful of applicants that take it all the way through to conclusion, and I think there's going to be a number of provisional licenses issued, and the state will have to decide which of the city's licensed applicants are going to be able to register.
And that fee is not refundable, so if they don't get a license, they still, have to pay that processing fee, which is, if we were to add up just the staff time in the processing fee, we're close to that amount before we even get it, halfway probably through the door with a background check and using, Ross's legal time. And the folks that do that in our police department are, they have a pretty thorough scrubbing there. So we'll also we'd have community development look through the application for the building requirements. So it may seem like a lot, but it's really not when you break it down by the staff time.
So that's a good point. At the time of application, do they have to indicate where they would be putting their business?
Yes. They don't have to have it all built out yet, but they have to provide a site plan. They're going to have to put some effort into their application.
So do we feel very confident that this number then will cover all the costs of all the departments involved in vetting an applicant? Because my concern is that our taxpayers shouldn't have to, the city shouldn't have to foot any of this bill for their application.
I think our group was reasonably confident that it would, but the best part of this structure is we can adjust it with a new resolution by this board. So that's a one meeting modification.
And like all of our rates, we try to take a look and adjust them, which that's city government speak for raise them, really, as our costs go up. So I would suggest now to the commission that, like most of our rates, those are things that will get more expensive. Things usually don't get less expensive with the city. That was for you, Charlie.
Any other questions on fees? Any comments? Any direction you want to give Ross? Are we good with the fee structure?
Okay.
I think you have your direction.
Thank you very much.
All right, then I think our third policy, I don't know if, Ross, are you continuing to take charge then with the proposed update in drug and alcohol policy for the city?
I believe so, yeah.
All right, take it away.
Okay, so staff spent some time trying to figure out if we have legalized medical marijuana and we have staff who might otherwise meet the criteria, under what circumstances are we going to allow that? And how's that going to work? Because it's not like you can just give someone who may be, high on cannabis a breathalyzer. It doesn't work the same way. So we spent some time going through this, and there's some key points that we worked through. First of all, possessing medical marijuana or being under the influence of medical marijuana while working for the city is prohibited, as is ingestion on the job or in city facilities. So you cannot use it on the job, and you cannot be under the influence of it when you come to work. It's just like alcohol in that way. Use of medical marijuana by medical marijuana card-holding employees while off-duty is permissible in some circumstances. However, the employee risks being subjected to random drug screening and potentially being impacted if there's reasonable suspicion that the employee is under the influence. So essentially, if there's reason to believe a person may be intoxicated, they might have to be screened for intoxication. There'll be some training for that to help supervisors know what to look for. And employees then can be disciplined or terminated if they are found to be intoxicated. Medical marijuana use by persons that hold positions deemed as safety sensitive. This would be public safety officials, CDL holders, or a subclass that we felt also needed to be in here, individuals who hold positions that require a high level of cognitive function. So civil engineers or drafters, building officials, finance staff who handle the city's resources, things of that nature. We can deem certain positions safety sensitive, and under those circumstances, we can prohibit them from using marijuana even off the clock. If you have a drug test showing that you have cannabis or a THC metabolite is the phrase that we use in your blood or in your body, and you have a safety sensitive designated position, you can be disciplined or terminated for that. So there's a subclass of our employees that, at least as it's written now, will not be permitted to use medical marijuana even if they have a card. So one of the questions we have for you is, are you comfortable with that? Because that does seem kind of heavy-handed, but there are a lot of compelling reasons why we felt that was appropriate. The ramifications of harming others or harming themselves or harming the public could be quite high. If you have someone driving a city garbage truck, for instance, that is using, and we can't always completely tell whether they are sober or not, we felt it was better to be safe than sorry.
Does this also include our police department and fire department? Would you have considered those?
It would seem logical, the answer is yes, but what we've done here is we've said supervisors and the city manager, we will make an effort to designate safety-sensitive positions, and that will be revisited regularly, but at least annually. So those haven't specifically been decided yet. It looks like the chief has a distinct opinion about that.
Madam Mayor, members of the commission, one of the things that the state has done for law enforcement, they actually passed a set of rules that prohibit that in their last rulemaking process. So you cannot have used marijuana within the last year to even get a job with the police department, and if you use it during it, you're terminated. You lose your certification.
Did they include like emergency personnel, firefighters? It's just police department?
This is just the law enforcement training center.
Thank you, Chief.
Yeah.
So Ross, do you want to reference the Yankton Fire Department, what our plan is there?
Yes. Okay, so in our conversations amongst our group, we talked about, well, there's sometimes interns and volunteers, and we want everybody to be working from the same set of rules. So the policy that's drafted right now says it also applies to all volunteers in the same way, so the classification doesn't really change anything. However, I hadn't anticipated what impact that would have on our volunteer fire department. So I've had a good conversation with Chief Kurtenbach about that, and my intention at this point is to say this, except the fire department, which will be subject to its own alcohol and drug abuse policy to be adopted in accordance with their bylaws, because they have some people don't know this, they have their own corporate structure, and there's some of that we can control, and I think we're going to want to make it clear that those who are driving the fire trucks, for instance, are prohibited, volunteer or otherwise, but
Right.
I got to work through that with the chief.
Okay, so you are in conversations with him, because I do know that that does exist, that there's certain rules that they follow that maybe others don't, just because of that, but because of their status. Okay.
Rossi, I think, I'm not putting this out there as a challenge upon myself, but I think the way that this is written, I could probably come up with a pretty good argument to exclude literally every single city employee.
Yeah, that's the art of how you delineate what's a safety sensitive position, and we run a risk if we come down too harshly. There's already a limited pool of qualified available employees, and we might have to scale some of this back in again if we start cutting off our labor pool to fill positions. We also appreciate the notion that the people who are using under this framework are doing it for medicinal purposes too, and it does have kind of a heavy-handed feel to it. But again, it seems like it's easier to start a little bit tighter and give up if we need to, as opposed to kill the fun.
So Commissioner Mybom, thank you for that comment. There are some cities who are just saying, no, we're not allowing that. We're just not going to allow that. And I completely understand that. However, you are violating our policy now if you have a prescription for pain medicine, for example, and you are using it in such a way that you're altered when you come to work. So that would be also, like a violation if you, I don't know, have a surgery and you're on pain medicine and you're taking it and you're performing your job function. So, we're trying to look at this for the time being, we think, unless the commission tells us otherwise, as medicine. And for those folks that are going to use it legitimately, and like medicine, some people will not use it legitimately, and we'll have to try to deal with that as we can. Now, if we get into recreation in our state, we're going to have a whole other discussion, certainly. But we're happy to take direction or thoughts or comments from anyone on the commission, especially if they have HR experience. Helpful to guide our discussion a little bit more too. I mean, it's what you guys think is best for all of us. I'm trying to kind of be open with it because I have just personal ideological feelings about it as well, so.
Bill, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. I know you've been a city manager as well, in your experience. What did you tackle and what did some of the towns or communities do in city entities that you've aided with?
We pretty much handled it the way you're looking at it, because there is options, because we were realists that it is out there, and with the people with the prescription cards, if it's monitored, it works. We didn't have a problem, but in the safety sensitive positions, you keep a closer eye on it. I've been retired for about 4 years now, but the 6 years while I was dealing with medical and recreational marijuana, we thought we were going to have a lot more problems than we did. We probably only had 4 or 5 my entire career, but we also started out a little hard at first to send a message that, it's almost a no tolerance, but it seemed to send a message to the employees and it worked. But I think you're looking at it like most of the cities and towns in Colorado. And I grew up in South Dakota, and South Dakota is certainly not Colorado, but a lot of the same situations and problems will follow marijuana.
So one of my questions would be, we will have employees, the way it's written right now, who, yes, you could say they're in a safety position, but we may not say they qualify as long as they're not under the influence while they're at work. When they take a random drug test, are we just going to, as long as it's random, it's not reasonable suspicion of currently being under the influence, they hold a medical card, are we just taking that panel off?
Yes.
Okay.
It's like if you have a prescription painkiller and you do the drug screen and it shows positive for narcotics, so you demonstrate you have a prescription, it's the same result in that situation. As long as it's not a safety sensitive position, it in theory would be just fine. It would not subject you to discipline. Not you, sorry, the employee.
Well, So anyhow, I like that you're giving yourself a lot of flexibility here to qualify or disqualify who it would be, but I think, especially when we get to the high cognitive functions, do we need to make that a little bit more black and white? Could we get ourselves in a situation where, if someone really had a medical card, had a medical reason for needing it, we may want to have a more black and white answer of who qualifies and who doesn't.
The way that it's written, the safety sensitive, it'll be like job description by job description. So when we make a position a safety sensitive position, we will actually be modifying the job description accordingly. At least that's what our group intended. So it will be clear who's subject to it and who is not.
Because some of them were non-safety sensitive. They were the high cognitive, the financial individuals, some of those, how are we, safety sensitive is a little easier to.
Right.
Yeah, so we need to, this, why we're getting this input tonight is, if your commission's thinking we're on the right path, we would sit down and go through our positions, our classifications, and just talk about them in terms of, what is this person's operation, not this person, but this position's operations, where do they fit in? We also have to talk about the unknowns. Some of our people who I would consider are non-safety sensitive, in March of 19, when we ended up having a flood, we were all safety sensitive positions, so we may have that discussion as well. I'm thinking most folks are going to fall into the category of high cognitive or safety sensitive, but perhaps not. And we need to talk about this with the supervisors about that as well, in the sense that in the field, Ross and I may not be as familiar with every position as the supervisors themselves.
Yep. I think it didn't make a lot of sense to nail down all of those positions until we were under the impression that this commission liked that approach, because if that seemed too heavy-handed, we wanted to know it, and we weren't going to spend a lot of time picking those out, I guess.
So under 905C, Ross, an employee must notify his or her immediate supervisor before beginning work when taking a medication or drug. So we will know if we have city employees that would have a medical marijuana card.
Supposed to and will tell you are maybe two different things.
We may or may
Correct,
not.
but I'm just saying.
That's the expectation. So as it works now with folks that, maybe have a surgery or have a reason that they're on a narcotic or a pain pill or taking that, they may say, that we may have they may not be, for example, somebody may be dropping them off for work and they may not have a vehicle, or we may make an accommodation so they're not driving because they're taking a medicine or something like that if they speak to us. Not necessarily we as an organization may know that, but either the human resources director or their immediate supervisor would know that. So it's not like it's something that we share, citywide or anything like that, but that would be the expectation, that if you're using that, and the employees will know that we're still going to be doing drug testing, that doesn't go away, so that they can communicate that with certain individuals in the organization, so we understand if that occurs, that they do get pulled for a drug test, they have that card and we have that knowledge. And
Now in here too, it talks about on and off duty. So on duty obviously makes sense not to have any at work, not to do it while you're at work, but some of those positions could be off duty. Correct me if I'm wrong, doesn't marijuana stay in the body for quite a long time? So I could have done it on Tuesday and Thursday, tested positive, and that still impairs my work. So I would, how does that work?
So the perception or discussion amongst the group and amongst us individually talking with each other about it is the notion that there are also lingering cognitive effects that are perhaps temporary in nature, but it can have an impact on your short-term memory and things of that nature we're worried about. Okay, so if you're in finance and you're working on paying the bills and you can't remember what your supervisor told you to do or what you were just doing 10 minutes ago, and we're thinking, well, wait a sec, if this has an impact on your cognitive abilities, even if it's temporary, we don't really want you playing with the city's money. So that was kind of how that evolved. Yes, you're not actually impaired, but the impacts of it last beyond being impaired. That was philosophically how we came to that.
And no different than taking a medicine that makes you sleepy,
Sure.
You might have taken it the night before, but you're still feeling groggy in the morning. Well, we don't want you driving a plow,
But let's use Al here as an example. You know, Al complains all the time about his arthritis, right? And so hydrocodone might have been an option for him from his doctor for years, but pretty soon you're going to have a CBD THC cream that he can put on his hands, and it's a very low dose THC. I mean, are we going to even, you know, in that employee handbook, tread on that? Because, you know, I understand when people are, you know, smoking a joint, I mean, that's a lot. However, we're also talking about medical marijuana as a product, and it's very targeted for people who have specific issues that maybe in years past only hydrocodone was able to work for them, and it's not working anymore, and all of a sudden there's this other option. And if it means that Al can continue to type away and do his job more effectively, and it is via a low dose ointment or gel on his hands, I don't know, I'm just using it as an example.
So you're talking about over the counter, if there's an over the counter?
This would be a prescription. This would be a prescription, you know, product that has THC in it.
You know, I think as we move, if that's the case, and, you know, an employee was tested, if they had a medical card, you know, that might be a discussion between supervisor and employee. You know, I don't know. In my experience, personnel issues are not ever black and white. There's a lot of shades of gray in them. So while it's not, you know, I feel like some of those things would have to be discretionary too. I mean, technically, you know, in my example I gave before, someone coming to work, you know, post-op that has pain medication, they're maybe not up to operating the heavy equipment, but can they come and do some of the functions of their job? Yes. But, you know, according to our policy, they shouldn't be there at all. But we try to work with people. We're fortunate that we know our employees well enough and we have good communication with them that they're between supervisor and employee or HR and employee, they tend to work with us pretty well. But yeah, it leaves the door open for something like that. You know, would they necessarily be altered at work if they, you know, they might test, but would they necessarily be altered? They might test positive, but that would be something we can continue to talk about.
Commissioner Maibaum, your example is the hard part of all of this. You know, where do you find that balance? And that's really why we're here trying to get your input collectively, because I see your point precisely. I don't want Al's joints to hurt if it's a matter of taking THC.
Neither. Come on.
A tincture or a cream that's likely not going to affect his memory in the same way that, you know.
Can I jump in here for a second, though, too? I worry a little bit about making the parameters too narrow in that the way we're talking about it is a little bit, we're suspicious of how people might use it, but there are legitimate uses, including cancer. And we have, if you look at some of our employees that have been here for 10, 15, 20, 25, 30 years, I would hate to have an employee feel like they couldn't access medical marijuana, which can help with appetite, insomnia, nausea. Instead of taking 500 pills, they could have access to this one thing, and I would hate for them to feel like they couldn't access that because this. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
You know, and that's where I think I'm struggling too, is I understand when it's something federal like a CDL. You know, it's not even an option. But I am a little bit nervous on how we can not allow someone to use something that is a legal option to them that's being prescribed by a physician. And I think we really need to make sure we fully understand. I understand wanting to limit things, but I think we need to fully understand what we're capable of and what.
Correct. Yeah, in essence of time, we do have a couple minutes left of the work session, so I don't know, Amy, I'll get to your comment, but if there's any other sections, Ross, that you specifically wanted to hit in this policy. The other thing I would point out is it is a policy, so can it be reviewed at any point once we start?
Yes, always. What I'm hearing is that we want to go back and take a look more, having heard some of your comments, take a look at the language again. We have a little more time on that because of our calendar here, so we'll keep working with Mr. Efting and our team Cannabis at the city, and we'll keep working on language and reach out to some of you who made specific comments. And if any commissioners have more thoughts or comments, talk to Ross and I, and because it is valuable discussion to have.
Yep. Thanks, everybody.
Any other last-minute comments about any of tonight's work session?
I would just side with some of these later comments in the discussion where I think in a lot of ways we're dealing with mythologies about marijuana and its impacts versus reality. And I think as we get more comfortable with living with it, whether it's just in a medical capacity or if it does actually expand to recreational, I think that will breed more comfort with what the reality of it is.
I agree. I mean, I did appreciate hearing from Bill that in his years of tenure of service as a city manager, there was only a handful of issues. So that is good to hear. And you're right, the myths behind it and what we all have to get used to, I think will be a work in progress for a long while to come. Amy and Ross, you have enough direction through the work session?
Yes, Mayor, thank you.
All right, hearing that, do I have a motion to, having no other business on our work session agenda, can I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
Can I just do all in favor? Is that all right? Okay. All right, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay? I doubt there's anybody abstaining. All right, that ends our work session. We'll begin in just a few minutes here with our actual city commission meeting.